Hello and welcome to this week's devlog for my procedurally generated voxel-based RPG game. This is a game about exploration, collectibles and loot. One thing it's not about though is having a name, although I'll get round to that soon. I make a devlog each week and... Okay. I missed last week's devlog due to various reasons. I feel very ashamed. I'll explain more about that at the end of the video, but part of the problem was that going into last Sunday, I had no footage of the game. There were quite a few reasons for this, but the main one was I went on a bit of a technical circle due to some rework ideas. Everything this week was just technical, so there's nothing really flashy for me to show you whatsoever. Basically, collision. Okay, so let's just remind ourselves where the game currently is in its development. I spent the past few months building up systems and procedures in order to construct gameplay. So that's things like character inspectors, level editors, gameplay systems, and so on. The game does look pretty unfinished right now, but that has a lot to do with the fact that it is. The gameplay follows this loop of begin the exploration, find items, monsters, visited places, eventually go and find the gateway, end the exploration, level up with the items you found, and repeat. Gradually, as you level up, you find more interesting items and the gameplay grows with it. So then, how much of that actual gameplay loop is actually there right now? I now have some visitable locations, they just don't really look very good yet, combat and the beginning of the level system. But the game is still hampered by technical issues, so it's very important to me that I fix all of these things so I have a solid base for when I actually begin to ramp up the content production. One problem I have right now, for instance, is that you can't actually restart the gameplay for a reason relating to the physics system. So this week I embarked on a journey to fix that problem. This is going to be quite a technical video, so maybe get some coffee or something. When the player does an attack, a collision trigger is spawned, and this is how the logic is dispatched. For this, I'm using my engine's built-in implementation of bullet physics, which also contains a collision system. It's based around this idea of senders and receivers, and essentially the idea is that the sender contains all the information telling you which functions to call when the collision occurs, and the receiver really just triggers that callback. While this has been a pretty good system, it has also suffered a problem. The way I designed my engine originally was that it was built around this concept of a single world. The idea was that if you had a game that just had a startup screen and then gameplay, the idea is that you'd be able to load in a save, start up the world, and begin playing from there. A problem I ended up with pretty quickly though was that in a game like this, if you wanted to have multiple worlds, say for instance if you went in to visit a place, then you wouldn't really be able to sort of queue these worlds up on top of each other. So you couldn't have two collision systems running at once. So frankly my engine was not designed for a game like this. Now that doesn't mean that I wouldn't be able to support it, but what it did mean was that I had to cut some corners. A problem I also had was that the world system had to be used in order to get access to the physics and entity component system, because they ultimately depend on it. However, it became pretty obvious over time that some change would have to be made in order to be able to properly support this game. So I made some decisions, and they were drastic. So I began by scoping out which bits of the engine would need to be redesigned. And this would be a fairly decent chunk of work, as the engine is written in C++, which means it's just generally stricter, and there's more hoops you have to jump through in order to get stuff to work. I did consider separating out versions of the physics worlds into their own objects, which would allow me to do more complicated things. I also then considered separating out the entity component system into a similar sort of object system. But unfortunately, the more I dug into this, the more I realised that it was just going to be a monumental job. As much as I did think this stuff would benefit the project in future, I can't deny that this stuff would have taken months and months. So, I had another think. And what I ended up questioning was, how much of this stuff could actually be implemented in scripts? So that would of course give me way more flexibility, but would also mean that stuff would just be way slower, because it's not in engine. I mulled this over for quite a while, but fundamentally there was one thing that convinced me. Have a quick look at this map. One of the things that I wanted to implement originally was a check in the world gen system to make sure that no two places overlapped with each other. I wanted to be smart about how I did this, however, so I wanted to use octrees, which is just a nice way to optimize the sort of collision detection algorithm. But I never actually got round to it because I didn't have time. And that got me thinking. I could implement a system that exists entirely in C++, all the heavy lifting for the collision system is done there, and then I expose that out to scripts in a way that you can create objects of this collision system, populate it with whatever points or shapes you need, and then just see what collides with what. This would generally be something so incredibly useful to have in the engine because it's collision systems, it's just nice. I can guarantee there'll be many cases where I would use that for other projects I work on with this engine in future, and I can benefit from it now. And not to mention that the system would probably be more optimized than the Bullet approach anyway, because the Bullet system is using 3D, where I only really need 2D. So that's a whole extra D that I don't need. So being able to guarantee that this collision system would come in useful at some point in future anyway, I just began implementing it. The plan was, get it implemented, switch the code for the collision in the world over, and then celebrate. However, it ended up taking pretty much all week. So I started off by designing how the system would look from an API perspective. The idea was that you'd just be able to create these collision points and then you get returned an ID, which you can just use to position the points in the world. You call process when you're ready and the system just generates you a list of all the collisions that occurred. One thing I wanted to add was the ability to specify your actual collision detection implementation. I started off with this just brute force implementation because I knew that would be easy to implement. That is essentially where you just check every single shape against every other shape and then determine which ones collided. It did take quite a while to get that in place, as remember I had to test it thoroughly, but after not too long I decided I would begin to try to implement it in the game. And as a result of doing that, I realised it wouldn't be that easy. The old physics system had support for a ton of things that I didn't have in this new system. That included the ability to do things like detect when something entered or left, masking ID system, as well as the senders and receiver system. So I knew that in order to get stuff in the game, I would just have to go through and implement all of these things. So I started doing that, and it took ages. I had done the odd technical tailspin this week, and unfortunately everything was technical, which meant that I had no interesting footage whatsoever. Coupled with the fact that I had to drive back home the next morning, I realised that I couldn't really justify pulling an all-nighter, because if I was to crash and die, then that wouldn't help the project at all. While I didn't really like doing it, I did realise that that was the most sensible option, so with another week I decided I wanted to get this stuff in the game and working. And ideally I wanted to also be able to repair my sleep schedule. I finished off the addition to the collision system by Wednesday with a bunch of new tests. I now had all the features I needed, including the ability to do the sender and receiver pattern, the ability to determine when a collision started or ended, as well as the masking system. I wanted to slowly introduce it to the game, so I set it up alongside what was there previously. I created this collision world wrapper class, which was really just there to wrap around the collision system and then allow for the calling of the necessary functions. So essentially emulating what was there previously. So with this I could register specific triggers such as this one for the EXP system. I completely stripped out any of the previous logic for the EXP collision system. After everything seemed to work as expected, I wanted to finish the week off by creating a demo of the collision system just to prove that everything looked as expected by visualizing it. And right now it still only has the brute force approach, but I hope to fix that in future with an Octree implementation or something similar. I think it won't be too difficult to really get some massive improvements out of it. But the thing is, in this step of the technical rework, the next step is going to be a fairly involved one, which I'm going to save for next week, because it is the re-implementation of the entity component system. Most of the collision logic that's left over can't be sorted out until I have that in place. As much as I didn't really mean to miss the last week's video, everything was just so technical, which really just made for a boring video. And I can't say that this is going to be the most exciting video that ever existed, but this is just what progress looks like. I did make an effort to sort out my sleeping pattern this week. I was doing things like getting up at 7 AM and then doing yoga stretches immediately afterwards to try to wake myself up properly. I'll try my best to stay on track because honestly the upload schedule was just getting later and later over time. But I do plan to do this whole YouTube thing for a number of years, so this initial stage and this initial game is really just a learning experience for me. So, the only thing that's left is that I need an outro.